Hey guys, tonight we trudge into the frozen expanse of the Arctic, where the wind bites like an impatient wolf and the snow crunches underfoot like a million tiny bells. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting a cozy night with a hot cocoa, but that's exactly why it's fascinating to imagine it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead, I'll wait. And while you're at it, post your location and local time. I want to know who's really awake to hear this madness. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to a sky tinged with pale pink, although sky feels generous when all you can see is endless whiteness stretching into oblivion. Your breath puffs clouds that freeze before they fully leave your mouth, frosting your eyelashes and sticking stubbornly to your beard, or your upper lip if you forgot a scarf. Historians still argue whether these Vikings considered frostbite a minor nuisance or a legitimate threat to their daily routines, but from where you stand, it feels less like debate and more like immediate, teeth-chattering reality. The snow under your boots squeaks rhythmically, almost like a subtle Arctic drumbeat keeping time with your own heartbeat. Every step is measured, careful, because thin ice might be hiding beneath a seemingly sturdy snowdrift. And speaking of hiding, here's a quirky tidbit. Some early Norse texts hint that children would sometimes test ice thickness by tossing small animals, probably rabbits, onto frozen ponds. Brutal by modern standards, yet oddly practical in a don't fall through and die kind of way. You trudge toward the cluster of semi-buried wooden structures that will serve as your temporary shelters. Wind whips across the plain, rattling the few remaining trees like bones clattering in a drawer. Imagine having no fireplace, just tightly packed turf and logs, relying entirely on insulation, body heat, and perhaps the occasional animal hide hung on the walls. Mainstream historical fact, these turf homes were surprisingly efficient, sometimes maintaining interior temperatures several degrees warmer than the biting outdoors. But of course, without a proper chimney, smoke from small fires would still drift in, leaving a lingering scent of charred moss, cozy in theory, suffocating in practice. As you step inside, the air smells damp, but strangely comforting. Your fingers brush frozen wooden beams, leaving little impressions that melt slowly in the body heat. You're not alone. A few Vikings, well, the imagined you, sit cross-legged, silently tending to their basic morning chores. Here, you notice the careful layering of skins, furs, and homemade wool, each piece a tactical decision. Fringe tip: some Arctic dwellers reportedly rub their skin with reindeer fat to prevent frostbite and windburn, giving them a glossy sheen that might also make them slippery if a predator, or the occasional sibling, tried to grab them. The conversation is low and murmured. One Viking demonstrates how to thaw a frozen fish without a fire, using only body heat and the residual warmth of the shelter. You try it and fail, watching the fish remain stubbornly rigid, an awkward reminder that survival isn't glamorous. Historians still argue whether these methods were widespread or experimental, but the effort alone feels like a rite of passage. You can almost hear your own inner voice whispering, "Congratulations, you're officially cold and mildly defeated." Outside, the wind flares up again, rattling the turf walls and sending a shiver down your spine. You hunker down, grateful for the human density around you. Social clustering wasn't just about warmth, it was a life-saving measure. Yet, there's room for humor even here. You catch yourself imagining someone slipping on the ice outside and landing face first into a snowdrift, looking like an accidental snow sculpture. That thought, silly as it seems, makes the Arctic feel a little more human. Your eyes wander to the horizon, where the sun barely teases the sky before ducking behind clouds of icy gray. Even at dawn, shadows stretch long across the snow, hiding small crevices and ice ridges that could easily break an ankle. The cold bites at your nose, but the thrill of presence, the pure, raw immersion in this landscape is undeniable. Fringe tidbit: some sagas hint Vikings would use the reflective snow to signal distant travelers, a primitive but surprisingly effective Arctic Morse code. You imagine tiny frozen flares of communication flashing across the ice. And then there's the sound. Beyond the wind, beyond the creaking timber, there's a subtle hum in the distance, ice expanding and contracting, a reminder that the world itself is alive, groaning and sighing under the pressure of winter. It's hypnotic, almost meditative. You settle into this rhythm, letting your body synchronize with the land, appreciating that survival here isn't just about brute force. It's about respect, patience, and learning to read whispers in the snow. As morning fully arrives, you note how the cold sharpens your senses. Every sound, smell, and movement feels exaggerated. You can hear the distant snap of ice shifting, the faint clatter of a bird winging across the sky, even the subtle crackle of frost melting on your fingertips. Mainstream history tells us that these heightened senses were essential for survival, giving Vikings the split-second reactions needed to fish, hunt, and navigate a merciless environment. Scholars still debate how much of this was learned versus instinctual, but standing here, you can't help but feel the Arctic teaching you its own lessons. You take a slow breath, letting the icy air fill your lungs and the weight of the day settle on your shoulders. The snow, the shelters, the frozen fish, they're all part of a delicate balance. One misstep, and survival slips further away, yet the ritual of waking, observing, and adapting continues. And as your eyes drift across the horizon, where pink light mingles with endless white, you sense a story unfolding, one of resilience, ingenuity, and, if you're lucky, a touch of humor in the face of relentless cold.
The turf walls press close as you move further inside, the interior surprisingly snug despite the Arctic wind thrashing outside. Your fingers trail over damp beams, and you notice the faint aroma of charred moss mixed with animal hide. You brace against the chill, realizing the Vikings didn't rely on a roaring fireplace. They relied on clever insulation, human proximity, and the occasional strategic fire pit, just enough to stave off hypothermia without filling the home with smoke. Historians still argue whether these turf dwellings could truly sustain warmth through the harshest winters, but standing here, it feels plausible. You notice the layout. Low ceilings, small windows, and narrow passages designed to minimize heat loss. The smoke from your small cooking fire curls lazily toward a crude vent near the roof, where it mingles with the steam rising from thawing fish. Fringe tidbit? Some archaeologists suggest that Vikings even packed turf walls with animal dung for extra insulation. Less glamorous than fur, but effective. You try not to think about the smell too much, though your nose can't help a subtle twitch. Survival sometimes means prioritizing warmth over aesthetic comfort. As you settle in, the rhythmic tapping of tools catches your attention. A neighbor shaves ice from a small wooden block, prepping it for a makeshift hearth. You watch closely, realizing that maintaining these shelters requires constant attention. Snowdrifts can pile against the walls in minutes, adding weight and threatening to collapse the roof. You shift, imagining a rogue windstorm slamming against the turf, rattling beams and sending flakes of frozen moss down like confetti at a festival you didn't want to attend. Humor, you notice, keeps you sane. The floor is layered with furs and woven mats, offering some comfort against the cold timber beneath. You spread out a small blanket, and your fingers appreciate the texture, the faint warmth it offers, and the subtle scent of animal oils. Mainstream historical fact, Vikings in the far north relied heavily on layered insulation from furs, wool, and grasses, a combination that could surprisingly stabilize interior temperatures. But the trade-off was that ventilation suffered, leaving interiors smoky at times. You cough lightly, picturing yourself in a modern, rustic Airbnb, complete with a smoky charm nobody asked for. Outside, the wind howls against the walls, shaking the structure and sending frost particles swirling in through small gaps. You notice that even the smallest breach can let in a gust sharp enough to steal your breath. This is where human ingenuity shines. Tiny barriers, layered cloth, and tightly packed turf all contribute to a surprisingly effective defense against the cold. Fringe observation? In some sagas, Vikings supposedly stuffed cracks with moss harvested from frozen rivers, claiming it tricked the winter itself. You chuckle, imagining winter as a sentient, easily fooled creature. You crouch near a small fire pit, watching your neighbor thaw a chunk of frozen fish, using nothing but body heat and hot stones. The process is slow, almost meditative. You mimic the motions, feeling the ice gradually give way, and reflect on the patience required in this lifestyle. Survival here is less about brute force and more about rhythm, observation, and attentiveness. Historians still argue whether these methods were universal or improvised depending on circumstance, but for you, it feels entirely logical. The shelter itself seems to breathe, expanding and contracting with the wind, a living entity shaped by snow, frost, and human hands. You trace the patterns of frost on the beams and notice intricate ice crystals forming like tiny sculptures. Quirky tidbit? Some Norse writings mention that Vikings believed certain frost patterns were omens, predicting the success of hunts or the severity of upcoming storms. You lean back against a moss-padded wall, contemplating your own small role in this age-old dance between humans and nature. Your fingers graze the tools scattered about. Knives, awls, and rudimentary hammers, each essential for maintaining the shelter, fixing a tear in the roof, or creating a slot for ventilation. You try to imagine a day without preparation, without constant vigilance, and shiver. The truth is, comfort was minimal, but the ingenuity was immense. Even minor victories like patching a crack or arranging insulation just right felt monumental. Humor, again, creeps in. You can almost hear a Viking muttering, "Well, at least it's not raining polar bears today." Time passes, marked by the subtle shift of light through the small openings. The Arctic sun, though dim, changes position, casting long, thin shadows across the frost-covered floor. You notice the delicate interplay of light on the ice, and for a moment the environment seems almost gentle. Mainstream historical fact, these homes were designed not just for warmth, but for light conservation. Small windows retained heat and prevented excessive exposure while maximizing whatever sun they could capture. Scholars still debate exactly how effective these measures were in extreme northern winters, but standing here, it certainly feels like clever engineering. You stretch your legs, careful not to disturb the thin layer of snow that has crept inside. The simplicity of these homes, turf, timber, furs, belie a sophisticated understanding of materials and environment. Every element serves multiple purposes: insulation, ventilation, comfort, and even psychological reassurance. Fringe tidbit? Some Viking dwellings reportedly included tiny niches for sacred objects or charms, intended to protect occupants from winter spirits. You smile at the idea of frostbitten ghosts haunting the edges of your imagination, a subtle reminder that survival often mingled with superstition. The wind's howl softens slightly, a temporary lull, allowing you to sit in relative quiet. You breathe in, letting the layered scents of moss, wood, and animal oil mingle, and you feel a strange intimacy with the space. Each beam, each tuft of grass, and every hardened snowdrift outside tells a story of endurance. You notice how laughter and small talk ripple through the shelter, easing tension and reinforcing community. Humor is warmth here, almost as much as the layered insulation you're sitting on. And so you settle, letting your eyes drift over the frost-patterned windows, the carefully constructed beams, and the vigilant neighbors. Inside these turf walls, surrounded by ingenuity, superstition, and small human moments, you start to understand that surviving without a fireplace wasn't just possible, it was an art form. The shelter hums around you, a quiet, living testament to the resilience, creativity, and humor required to thrive in the Arctic's unforgiving grasp.
You step outside, boots crunching against the snow, and immediately feel the Arctic bite in full force. The wind is sharp, sliding under your layers, whispering promises of frostbite if you linger too long. Yet the day's task awaits: fishing. You shuffle toward the frozen fjord, your breath fogging and sticking to the edges of your scarf, and notice the subtle glimmer of ice under the faint sunlight. Historians still argue whether Viking fishing techniques were purely seasonal or adapted meticulously to the exact thickness of ice and local fish behavior, but standing here, it's clear that precision was everything. The ice stretches for what seems like miles, a crystalline expanse, interrupted only by patches of snow. Your fingers grip a simple wooden rod, the line dangling over a small hole chipped through the ice. Fringe tidbit: some Norse sagas claim that fishermen would whisper to the fish, urging them politely to bite, or curse them if the day's catch was slow. You can't help but mimic the motions, muttering under your breath, feeling absurd and strangely connected to this centuries-old ritual. You lower your line and wait, noticing the eerie silence of the Arctic, except for the distant scrape of ice shifting. Even the smallest sound carries far in this frozen expanse. The patience required is immense. Fishing isn't an adrenaline rush here. It's meditation, with an occasional thrill when a tug finally comes. Mainstream historical fact: preserved fish with a staple of Viking diets, especially in winter, providing vital protein and calories. Without electricity or refrigeration, success depended on timing, knowledge of fish habits, and sheer perseverance. As the day unfolds, you inspect your catch, noticing each fish glistening with frost, fins stiff but intact. Some are immediately frozen for storage, a practice that allowed communities to survive months of Arctic darkness. You handle them carefully, knowing that improper freezing could ruin precious provisions. Fringe tidbit: archaeologists have discovered hooks and nets made from braided sinew, suggesting an intricate craft passed down through generations. You admire the simplicity, yet ingenuity, thinking that a modern fisherman, with all the tech, might struggle to match this skill. The sun hangs low in the sky, though in some Arctic regions it barely dips at all. You cast another line, feeling the chill in your fingertips despite thick gloves. Every movement is deliberate, checking the hole, adjusting your bait, inspecting the ice for cracks. Scholars still debate whether Vikings preferred open water fishing in summer or ice fishing in winter, but here, ice dominates, and your success hinges on understanding its subtle signs. A group of neighbors appears across the fjord, similarly engaged in the silent pursuit. You wave, and they respond with nods or small gestures. The community aspect of survival is undeniable. Alone, this day would be long and dangerous, but together, there's warmth, camaraderie, and shared vigilance. Humor emerges in small ways. One fisherman's hat slips over his eyes and he bumps gently into a frozen drift, eliciting muffled laughter that echoes across the ice. You bend to inspect a net stretched over a shallow part of the fjord, frozen in place. The woven cord traps fish with minimal effort, a passive harvest requiring careful placement. Mainstream historical fact: Vikings used nets of varying sizes, sometimes weighted with stones to maximize efficiency. Fringe note: some accounts mention nets coated in fish oil to prevent freezing, a practice debated among historians for feasibility, but ingenious if true. You mimic the motion, adjusting the net, imagining your ancestors performing the same intricate dance, hands raw from cold but precise with purpose. Lunch comes in the form of quickly thawed fish, seared over small stones, heated in a portable fire pit. You taste the first bite, pleasantly surprised by the flavor. Simple, fresh, and surprisingly satisfying. Humor sneaks in as you note the irony of cooking over stones in the Arctic, a makeshift stove that might seem laughable to anyone with a modern kitchen. Yet here, every small meal feels triumphant,
a reward for patience, skill, and resilience. The day stretches, shadows moving slowly across the ice. You track subtle signs, fish beneath the surface, wind direction, and the occasional drifting snow patch. Each observation informs your next move, reinforcing that survival is as much about knowledge as it is about effort. Scholars still argue about the exact techniques used for fish preservation, whether hung in the wind, buried in snow, or stored in rudimentary icehouses. You imagine each method, appreciating the creativity and adaptability required to keep entire communities nourished. As the sun hovers near the horizon, you gather your catch, checking that each fish is properly frozen or stored. You notice the shimmer of frost on the nets, the tiny spikes forming where water has dripped and frozen again. There's beauty here, stark and precise, a reminder that survival isn't devoid of aesthetics. Fringe tidbit. Some Viking fishermen reportedly carved small charms into ice blocks, leaving them in the fish storage as talismans for luck. You chuckle, imagining tiny ice gods watching over your catch. The journey back to your turf shelter is arduous, each step weighted with the day's labor and the Arctic chill. The fjord stretches like a mirror beneath the fading light, reflecting your solitary trek and the faint orange-pink hue of sunset, or what passes for it this far north. Mainstream historical fact: winter fishing was a daily necessity for sustenance, with communities relying on both fresh and preserved catches to survive months of darkness. You can almost hear the rhythm of countless footsteps, past and present, marking the ice in silent continuity. Back inside, you thaw your fingers slowly and admire the array of frozen fish stacked neatly for future meals. The simplicity of this life, combined with meticulous attention to detail, creates a strange satisfaction. Humor lingers as you imagine modern kitchens struggling to replicate such efficiency with far less ingenuity. The Arctic may be harsh, but your day proves one thing. With knowledge, patience, and a touch of creativity, survival is not just possible, it can feel like a quiet triumph.
You return to the turf shelter, your fingers still tingling from hours spent handling icy fish, and take stock of the clothing layers that have kept you alive today. The Arctic doesn't forgive sloppiness. Every garment serves a purpose. Thick wool close to your skin, multiple layers of animal furs, and a final outer shell designed to deflect wind and trap heat. Mainstream historical fact: Vikings in far northern settlements relied on sophisticated layering techniques, often combining animal hides, wool, and occasionally linen for insulation. Fringe tidbit: some accounts suggest that rubbing a mixture of reindeer fat and herbs on exposed skin could prevent frostbite while imparting a faint, musky aroma that might also ward off insects, a bizarre multitasking hack. You tug at your mittens, inspecting small cracks where moisture has seeped in. Windproofing is an ongoing battle. No garment, however meticulously layered, is perfect against Arctic gusts. You pull on an extra hood, noting the thick seams and layered stitching designed to trap warmth. Scholars still argue about how much of this clothing strategy was standard versus improvised depending on available resources, but the underlying principle is universal. Warmth is life, and efficiency in layering equals survival. Standing near a small wooden chest, you find an assortment of odd remedies, many of which would seem absurd in a modern first aid kit. A small jar of crushed herbs sits beside a slab of fat. A Viking neighbor demonstrates smearing the fat over hands and face before heading out, claiming it acts as a barrier against both windburn and freezing temperatures. You laugh quietly, imagining someone today trying the same and leaving a greasy trail across a car seat. Yet it works. Your cheeks burn less, and the skin feels surprisingly protected. You pull on thick, fur-lined boots, the soles hardened to resist frozen ground and slick ice. Movement is careful, measured. One misstep could land you on your back, and Arctic snow can be both soft and treacherously hard beneath a thin layer of powder. Fringe tidbit: some Norse sagas mention the use of animal tendons or rawhide strips as foot bindings, providing extra traction when traversing slippery surfaces, a primitive but effective form of winter crampons.
Humor creeps in as you picture an unsteady Viking flailing dramatically across the ice, a scene both terrifying and absurd. You glance at the shelter's small fire pit, currently dormant, and realize that even with layers, being stationary makes the chill creep back quickly. You huddle near the pit, observing a neighbor gently warming stones that will serve as a temporary heating element for drying clothes or warming small meals. Mainstream historical fact, without a fireplace, Vikings relied on strategic heating using hot stones and controlled microfires, which could radiate heat without filling the home with smoke. Scholars still debate how widespread this practice was, but you can feel its utility firsthand. As you sit, you notice subtle changes in your body temperature. Circulation slows in the extremities, prompting fidgeting, stretching, and rubbing of limbs to restore warmth. You experiment with motions, shaking hands and flexing toes inside thick boots. Fringe tidbit: some northern settlers reportedly practiced percussive warming, tapping fingers and legs rhythmically to stimulate blood flow, a technique that sounds odd but is surprisingly effective. Humor softens the harshness. You feel slightly ridiculous, but undeniably warmer, a reminder that necessity breeds innovation. You check the other residents of the shelter. Everyone is engaged in small, repetitive tasks, repairing a tear in clothing, braiding extra fur into mittens, or preparing scraps for cooking later. There's an underlying rhythm to these motions, almost meditative, a subtle choreography keeping the group alive and functioning. Mainstream historical fact: community cooperation in maintaining clothing and gear was crucial in Arctic settlements. One failure could imperil several people. Historians still argue whether individual initiative or communal responsibility was more valued, but both clearly mattered. A lighthearted moment unfolds as one neighbor demonstrates a fashion experiment, wrapping a series of mismatched furs around their torso. Laughter erupts quietly through the shelter, a soft counterpoint to the icy landscape outside. Humor, you notice, is as essential as clothing. It preserves mental resilience, reduces tension, and creates bonds among people trapped together in harsh conditions. Fringe tidbit: there are tales of Viking contests to see who could fashion the warmest yet most aesthetically absurd outfit, a tradition whose practicality is debatable, but whose spirit surely lifted morale. You inspect the layering yourself, adjusting scarves, hoods, and mittens for maximum efficiency. Each piece has a subtle role, whether trapping heat, blocking wind, or preventing snow intrusion. Mainstream historical fact: the layering principle was complemented by natural fibers' insulating properties. Wool retains warmth even when damp, and fur provides a barrier against wind. Scholars still debate whether these techniques were transmitted through structured training or learned experientially, but either way, the knowledge was life-saving. Finally, you take a slow, measured breath, feeling the weight of each layer against your body. The Arctic wind presses against the shelter walls, a reminder that no clothing, no matter how ingeniously layered, is invincible. Yet with these strategies, with this combination of warmth, ingenuity, and a touch of humor, survival feels manageable. You run your hands over fur, wool, and stitched hides, marveling at the resourcefulness that allowed humans to endure months of relentless cold. And as you settle in, slightly greasy from protective fats and a little amused by the fashion show, you understand that clothing is not just protection. It's a lifeline, a statement, and sometimes a source of laughter in a world that gives little cause for levity.
You step outside again, the surreal brightness of the Arctic sun hitting your eyes and forcing you to squint beneath your hood. It's midnight, technically, yet the world is bathed in the soft, unbroken light that seems to stretch forever. The concept of day and night feels almost meaningless here, and you realize the body's natural rhythms are confused, lulled by the persistent glow. Historians still argue whether the Vikings fully adapted to 24-hour daylight or suffered periodic sleep disruptions, but you can feel the subtle tug of fatigue creeping into your limbs despite the visual trickery. Walking across the snow, you notice the way shadows play on the frozen ridges, long and elongated, creating patterns that shift slowly as the sun arcs weakly across the horizon. Fringe tidbit: some Norse storytellers suggested that the continuous light encouraged spirits to wander more freely, requiring travelers to carry small charms or markings on their sleds to avoid misfortune. You can't help but chuckle at the idea of an overzealous frost spirit judging your midnight expedition. You trudge toward a frozen river where ice blocks glimmer like glass sculptures. Here, the daily hunting and gathering continue, shaped not just by survival needs, but by the peculiar rhythm of constant sunlight. Mainstream historical fact: 24-hour daylight allowed for extended fishing, hunting, and crafting periods during summer months, an advantage that could boost food stores and prepare communities for harsh winter months. Scholars still debate whether extended light induced more productivity or increased exhaustion, but you noticed both extremes in yourself. The surreal illumination turns ordinary tasks into almost dreamlike experiences. You examine ice cracks, test snow for hidden weak points, and navigate familiar terrain that seems alien under the persistent sun. Fringe tidbit: Viking logs mention sun-mad moments, periods when hunters, dazzled by constant daylight, mistook snowdrifts for prey or wandered further than intended. You find yourself double-checking each step, half expecting a rabbit or a fox to leap out from a glittering snowbank. Humor sneaks in. Midnight feels like a daytime prank on your senses. As you move along the riverbank, you notice fellow travelers hauling small sleds stacked with frozen fish and supplies. The Arctic community is alive with quiet activity, all under the watchful eye of a sun that refuses to sleep. You nod to a neighbor, receiving a brief, weary grin in return. Mainstream historical fact: 24-hour daylight allowed for extended efforts in moving supplies, repairing structures, and preparing for storms, a critical factor in Arctic survival. Scholars still debate how much daylight affected social interaction versus purely practical tasks, but the benefit is clear in the efficiency you witness. You take a break on a small rise overlooking the ice, letting the sun's diffuse glow wash over your face. The landscape stretches in gentle, endless whites and pale blues, occasionally punctuated by dark rocks or distant trees. Fringe observation: some saga suggested that prolonged exposure to the midnight sun induced vivid dreams or hallucinations among Vikings, blurring the lines between reality and imagination. You squint at a distant drift and swear it looks like a tiny fortress, perhaps an illusion crafted by the light itself. The surreal beauty of the light transforms ordinary hazards into poetic challenges. Every crack in the ice, every hidden ridge becomes a visual puzzle, forcing you to engage fully with the environment. Humor surfaces as you imagine a Viking warrior, sword in hand, squinting at a snowbank and declaring it a worthy opponent. Survival, you realize, is as much a mental exercise as a physical one, requiring focus, awareness, and a willingness to laugh at the absurdity of it all. As night technically creeps closer, the sun dips slightly, casting longer shadows across the snow. You notice patterns forming in the frozen landscape, subtle waves in the ice, frosty ridges glinting, and the faint reflection of distant sleds. Mainstream historical fact: extended daylight allowed Vikings to travel greater distances, scout new hunting grounds, and maintain visibility for safety, a stark contrast to the dangerous, sunless winters. Scholars still argue whether extended light induced more productivity or increased exhaustion, but your mind is alert, senses heightened, and body responsive. You pause to observe wildlife. A lone bird skims the icy surface, reindeer tracks curve across snowfields, and occasionally a fox's shadow flickers past. Fringe tidbit: ancient texts describe midnight hunts, where constant light enabled nocturnal tracking, a practice both fascinating and exhausting. You imagine yourself tracing the same tracks, footsteps careful, eyes scanning for motion, balancing focus with fatigue. Humor creeps in again as you envision arguing with a fox over territory in the soft glow, an absurd negotiation in the midnight sun. Continuing along the river, the endless light imposes a slow, hypnotic rhythm on your movements. Every detail, the texture of snow, the shimmer of ice, the faint scent of frozen fish and wet fur, seems magnified, creating a heightened awareness of your surroundings. Mainstream historical fact: surviving under constant daylight required adaptation not just in activity, but in mental resilience, teaching early Arctic dwellers to pace themselves, rest strategically, and maintain morale. Historians still debate how much conscious these adaptations were versus instinctual, but every careful step you take echoes the trial and error wisdom of centuries past. By the time you return to the turf shelter, muscles slightly weary but senses alert, the Arctic's persistent glow has imbued you with both awe and respect. The midnight sun is mesmerizing yet relentless, a constant reminder of nature's extremes. Fringe observation. Some Vikings noted that returning to enclosed shelters after extended daylight offered a comforting contrast, almost like stepping from an overwhelming dream into a controlled reality. You step inside, pulling your layers tighter, feeling a strange satisfaction in surviving yet another day or night that the sun refuses to acknowledge.
The next morning, or what passes for morning, you strap on your boots and adjust the layers of fur and wool that have become almost second skin. The Arctic landscape greets you with its familiar, blinding white glare, and you brace yourself for travel across frozen fjords and plains. Ice travel is an entirely different challenge from the controlled chaos of the shelter or the deliberate patience of fishing. Mainstream historical fact, Vikings traversed Arctic landscapes using sleds, skis, or snowshoes depending on terrain, often hauling heavy loads of fish, firewood, and tools. Scholars still argue whether these methods evolved regionally or were adapted ad hoc by each community, but you quickly recognize the practical brilliance behind them. You secure supplies to a small sled and tug it across a snowy plain. The friction between sled runners and ice is mercifully minimal, though a hidden bump or thin ice could send your cargo tumbling. Fringe tidbit, some sagas describe the use of small carved wooden animals on sled runners, supposedly to guide the sled or appease mischievous ice spirits. You laugh quietly to yourself, imagining tiny enchanted reindeer helping you navigate across the fjord, a mix of superstition and whimsy that somehow feels appropriate in this frozen expanse. Your boots crunch rhythmically on snow, each step measured to maintain balance while hauling the sled. You note subtle textures underfoot, patches of hard ice, soft snowdrifts, and frost-crusted ridges that threaten to tilt the sled if misjudged. Humor creeps in as you imagine yourself flailing, half running, half sliding, in a dramatic battle with physics that your Viking ancestors would have found entirely mundane. Mainstream historical fact, the ability to judge ice thickness and snow stability was crucial for safe sledging, and miscalculations could mean lost supplies or worse. You pause to catch your breath and survey the frozen terrain. Fjords stretch in jagged lines, with occasional ice fissures glinting ominously in the weak sunlight. Fringe tidbit, some northern communities carved markers into ice or snow, effectively primitive trail signs, to navigate safely across seemingly uniform landscapes. You notice one faint marker ahead and feel a subtle surge of reassurance, grateful for centuries-old survival wisdom encoded in simple strokes of ice and stone. The sled's load shifts slightly as you navigate a gentle incline, forcing you to adjust your stance and redistribute weight. Mainstream historical fact, balancing loads on sleds was an essential skill, with improperly distributed cargo causing accidents or increased fatigue. Scholars still debate whether sled design varied more according to terrain or available materials, but observing the way your sled glides across the plain, it's clear that both factors were critical. You continue, noting small hidden obstacles, icy ridges that catch the sled runner, patches of snow that conceal thin ice, and subtle depressions that could easily trip the unwary traveler. Fringe tidbit, some accounts suggest Viking sleds included rudimentary shock-absorbing elements, like bundled moss or leather pads to smooth the ride across uneven surfaces. You test this theory instinctively, bouncing slightly to see if your makeshift padding helps, and quietly congratulate yourself when the sled glides more smoothly. As the journey stretches on, you sense your body adapting to the rhythm, a constant tugging, sliding, and adjusting. Your muscles ache, but there's a meditative cadence in each step. Humor surfaces as you imagine an observer from a tropical climate watching the slog and questioning your sanity, while you simultaneously imagine your ancestors finding humor and watching newcomers navigate familiar ice. Mainstream historical fact, physical conditioning was inherent to survival in Arctic regions. Stamina, strength, and agility determined life or death. You reach a narrow frozen stream, requiring careful maneuvering. The sled teeters slightly, demanding your full attention.
Fringe observation: Viking sled travelers reportedly used long poles to test ice thickness ahead of each step, an improvisation that doubled as a tactile guide. You mimic the motion, tapping gently before committing, feeling a mixture of nervousness and triumph with each safe crossing. Humor creeps back in as you imagine a Viking child gleefully tapping ice for fun, while adults grimly perform the same task out of necessity. The horizon stretches endlessly, white interrupted only by dark rock formations and distant trees. Your mind drifts to the absurdity of hauling a sled across a frozen expanse, while the midnight sun or perpetual daylight plays tricks on your sense of time. Mainstream historical fact: traveling under extended daylight allowed longer treks and more efficient supply transport, although the constant light often disrupted sleep and forced travelers to adapt unconsciously. Scholars still argue whether mental fatigue or overexertion claimed more victims than environmental hazards. You finally approach a small outpost marked by low turf walls barely peeking above the snow. Relief washes over you as the sled slows and you carefully guide it to a stop. Fringe tidbit: some sagas recount travelers leaving small offerings at these waypoints, a token for safe passage or a joke to amuse passing spirits. You imagine leaving a tiny fish charm, half for luck, half as a nod to your own absurd journey. Humor softens the Arctic rigor, reminding you that survival, while demanding, is punctuated by whimsy, human ingenuity, and the occasional lighthearted superstition. You take a moment to catch your breath, savoring the accomplishment. Every frozen plain, ice crack, and snow ridge has tested patience, strength, and focus. The Arctic is relentless, yet you notice the subtle beauty in patterns etched by wind, the glint of ice under sunlight, and the quiet camaraderie of shared survival. Mainstream historical fact: sled travel was a backbone of Arctic logistics, essential for transporting food, firewood, and tools, connecting communities across otherwise impassable terrain. You feel an intimate connection to centuries of Arctic travelers who trod these same expanses, balancing ingenuity, endurance, and humor in the face of extreme conditions.
You step into the semi-insulated turf hall, the familiar scent of moss, animal hides, and smoke greeting you like an old friend. The air is damp but surprisingly warm, a small relief after trudging across the icy plains with a sled heavy with fish and supplies. Communal life here is as vital as your clothing or tools. Survival depends not only on skill and endurance, but on shared effort, social rituals, and small bursts of humor that lighten the relentless Arctic environment. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were primarily pragmatic or had deep spiritual significance, but the benefits are evident. Around a low fire pit, neighbors gather in circles, exchanging news of the ice, discussing the day's catches, and comparing notes on weather patterns. Fringe tidbit: some sagas describe contests where the best storyteller was rewarded with extra fish or furs, a playful way to incentivize oral history and maintain morale. You sink onto a fur mat, grateful for the warmth, and watch as tales unfold, each one punctuated with laughter or exaggerated gestures that make the cold outside feel more distant. You notice the subtle rhythms of the hall: someone tending a pot of thawing fish, another repairing a torn garment, and a third sharpening tools with rhythmic precision. Mainstream historical fact: communal tasks were central to Viking Arctic survival, ensuring that everyone had clothing, food, and functional shelters. Scholars still debate the exact balance between structured duty and voluntary cooperation, but the coordination here feels almost choreographed, a dance dictated by necessity. As the evening unfolds, stories flow, blending historical fact, personal experience, and fringe folklore. You listen to a tale of a hunter who claimed to have outwitted a fox by mimicking its calls, a story both entertaining and subtly instructive about local fauna. Humor bubbles quietly in your chest as you imagine the scene, picturing a lone fox bewildered by a human's imitation. Fringe tidbit: some narratives included minor exaggerations of supernatural interference, like wind spirits reshaping ice to guide or mislead travelers, a playful way to frame real environmental hazards. The shared laughter and storytelling ease tension. You notice how humor functions as a subtle form of psychological insulation, counteracting fatigue, cold, and isolation. Mainstream historical fact:
Oral tradition was a cornerstone of Norse culture, transmitting survival knowledge, societal norms, and cultural identity in engaging, memorable ways. Scholars still argue whether exaggerated tales served primarily as entertainment, education, or moral guidance. But sitting here, the benefits of all three are clear. A neighbor demonstrates a simple game, sliding small stones across the ice-like floor toward a target. The rules are loose, and the competitive energy is tempered with laughter and exaggerated complaints. Fringe observation. Games in Arctic communities often doubled as training for coordination, judgment, and strategic thinking, subtly preparing participants for hunting or travel challenges. You join in, feeling your own balance and reflexes tested, and chuckle at your awkward attempts while secretly appreciating the subtle skill building. As night, or the illusion of night, deepens, you notice subtle rituals emerging. Small charms are hung near sleeping spaces, herbs burned to purify the air, and blankets arranged in communal patterns that maximize warmth. Mainstream historical fact. These rituals reflect a blend of superstition, practical safety measures, and psychological comfort, a unique integration of survival and culture. Scholars still debate how much the mystical elements influence daily routines versus serving as morale boosters, but the layered significance is clear in the hushed reverence and careful attention to detail. You settle into a spot near the central fire pit, observing neighbors meticulously preparing the next day's provisions. Fish are sorted, nets are repaired, and supplies are inventoried. Humor surfaces again when someone fumbles with a bundle of cords, eliciting a small chorus of chuckles. You reflect on how these shared, minor mishaps build community, softening the harshness of Arctic life and creating bonds stronger than any layer of fur or wool could provide. Fringe tidbit. Some sagas describe communal work sessions that transformed into impromptu storytelling or music making, turning chores into both social glue and cultural preservation. The stories continue, some recounting legendary hunts, others mundane observations about ice conditions, each blending practical knowledge with entertainment. Mainstream historical fact. Such exchanges were vital for passing down strategies for survival, navigation, and understanding animal behavior, ensuring that each generation was equipped for the Arctic's unforgiving challenges. Scholars still argue whether humor and exaggeration diluted or enhanced the educational content, but the engagement and attention of all present suggest it was effective either way. Finally, as the communal night draws to a close, you feel a deep sense of continuity. The Arctic wind may howl outside, storms may rage unpredictably, and frost may nip at every exposed inch. Yet inside this hall, social rituals, storytelling, and shared humor create an invisible warmth that rivals any fire. Fringe observation. Vikings often recorded notable communal events in oral memory, sometimes codifying lessons about cooperation, resource management, and even emotional resilience. You realize that the Arctic survival isn't just about cold weather skills. It's about human connection, laughter, and the shared experience of enduring extreme conditions together.
You rise early, or what passes for early in the Arctic, and step into the soft glow of the sun that barely dips below the horizon. Today's task is tracking elusive prey, reindeer, birds, or small Arctic mammals, each step a careful negotiation with the icy terrain. Mainstream historical fact. Hunting was a cornerstone of Viking Arctic survival, supplementing fish and stored provisions with protein and hides. Scholars still debate the balance between hunting and fishing in different settlements, but you quickly appreciate the energy, skill, and timing required to succeed in both. Your eyes scan the snow, noting subtle disturbances. Footprints, broken twigs, and faint tracks that could indicate animal presence. Fringe tidbit. Norse hunters reportedly used small carved whistles to mimic bird calls or rustling, tricking prey into revealing themselves. You experiment with a soft imitation, ears straining for a response, and a small fox darts across the snow, pausing long enough for you to feel a thrilling twinge of connection to centuries of hunters before you. You approach a ridge where reindeer tracks are faintly etched into the snow. Every step is cautious. The snow conceals dips, ice sheets, and thin patches. Humor creeps in as you imagine a Viking warrior slipping dramatically while trying to appear stealthy, a cautionary tale for the modern imagination. Mainstream historical fact. Hunting was a cornerstone of Viking Arctic survival. Scholars still debate the balance between hunting and fishing in different settlements, but you quickly appreciate the energy, skill, and timing required to succeed in both. Your eyes scan the snow, noting subtle disturbances, footprints, broken twigs, and faint tracks that could indicate animal presence. Fringe tidbit: North hunters reportedly used small carved whistles to mimic bird calls or rustling, tricking prey into revealing themselves. You experiment with a soft imitation, ears straining for a response, and a small fox darts across the snow, pausing long enough for you to feel a thrilling twinge of connection to centuries of hunters before you. You approach a ridge where reindeer tracks are faintly etched into the snow. Every step is cautious. The snow conceals dips, ice sheets, and thin patches. Humor creeps in as you imagine a Viking warrior slipping dramatically while trying to appear stealthy, a cautionary tale for the modern imagination. Mainstream historical fact: hunting was a cornerstone of Viking Arctic survival. Scholars still debate the balance between hunting and fishing in different settlements, but you quickly appreciate the energy, skill, and timing required to succeed in both. Your eyes scan the snow, noting subtle disturbances, footprints, broken twigs, and faint tracks that could indicate animal presence. Fringe tidbit: North hunters reportedly used small carved whistles to mimic bird calls or rustling, tricking prey into revealing themselves. You experiment with a soft imitation, ears straining for a response, and a small fox darts across the snow, pausing long enough for you to feel a thrilling twinge of connection to centuries of hunters before you. You approach a ridge where reindeer tracks are faintly etched into the snow. Every step is cautious. The snow conceals dips, ice sheets, and thin patches. Humor creeps in as you imagine a Viking warrior slipping dramatically while trying to appear stealthy, a cautionary tale for the modern imagination. Mainstream historical fact: tracking skills were highly valued in Arctic communities, taught from childhood, and refined through experience to ensure food security. Fringe observation: some sagas claim hunters followed animal patterns not just for sustenance, but also to predict seasonal migrations and anticipate weather changes, blending practical observation with folklore. Pausing at a frozen pond, you spot a cluster of birds pecking near an ice-free patch. You crouch low, testing the wind direction, adjusting your approach. Fringe tidbit: early hunters sometimes used mirrors or reflective ice to distract or confuse prey, an inventive adaptation to harsh visual environments. You try a small improvisation, angling your hand to catch sunlight on the snow, marveling at the ingenuity encoded in centuries of trial and error. The hunt is a delicate dance. Every movement, shifting weight, repositioning, adjusting your line of sight, is calculated. Mainstream historical fact: stealth and patience were often more important than brute strength, as Arctic prey was sensitive to the slightest noise or scent. Scholars still argue about the exact role of ritual versus practical skill in hunting practices, but you notice both intertwined in every careful step. You follow a set of reindeer tracks across the plateau, noting subtle variations in stride and depth. Fringe tidbit: hunters sometimes carried small tokens or charms to bless a successful hunt, combining superstition and practicality in a mental toolkit for resilience. Humor appears again as you imagine a Viking whispering to their charm, "Please don't let this one kick me into the snow." You smile, acknowledging the absurdity that blends seamlessly with necessity. After hours of careful tracking, you find the reindeer grazing quietly near a snow-dusted ridge. You crouch, observing wind direction, terrain, and escape routes, factors critical in deciding whether to pursue or wait. Mainstream historical fact: successful hunting required deep understanding of animal behavior, weather patterns, and landscape reading, a combination that developed over generations. Scholars still debate the extent to which young hunters were formally trained versus learning entirely through observation, but your cautious approach reflects both methods. A sudden movement catches your eye, a fox slipping along the snow's edge, perhaps watching the same prey. Fringe observation: some Norse hunters noted fox behavior as indicators of larger herd movements, suggesting an ecological awareness far ahead of its time. You pause, quietly appreciating the interconnectedness of predator and prey, human and animal, and the subtle lessons embedded in every interaction. Humor surfaces as you imagine the fox judging your tracking skills silently from its vantage point, a tiny critic of Arctic hunting etiquette. The day unfolds slowly, punctuated by small victories, identifying subtle tracks, safely approaching prey, and observing wildlife patterns. Mainstream historical fact:
Hunting provided not only food but also materials for clothing, tools, and trade, emphasizing its centrality to survival and social cohesion. Scholars still debate the precise tools and methods employed for Arctic hunting, though archaeological finds suggest a mixture of ingenuity, adaptation, and experimentation. As dusk, or the Arctic equivalent, approaches, you review your tracks, noting successes and near misses. Each lesson embeds itself subtly: patience, observation, adaptation, and humility before the land and its creatures. Fringe tidbit: Viking hunters sometimes marked significant hunting accomplishments with symbolic carvings on tools or sleds, creating a narrative of personal achievement intertwined with survival. Humor persists in imagining a small tally carved into your sled. 1 fox avoided, 0 humans embarrassed. So far. The trek back to your turf shelter is quiet, punctuated by distant sounds of ice cracking or birds calling. You feel the rhythm of Arctic hunting, patient, strategic, and full of subtle joys and small absurdities. Every sight, sound, and cautious step reinforces a profound respect for survival skills honed over generations, a blend of practical wisdom, folklore, and humor that has carried Arctic communities through centuries of relentless conditions.
You arrive back at the turf shelter, limbs stiff and fingers tingling from hours of Arctic exertion, and immediately notice the familiar warmth radiating from communal activity. Inside, neighbors are engaged in sorting fish, mending clothing, and preparing furs for the coming cold night. Mainstream historical fact: maintaining and repairing clothing, gear, and provisions was a continuous process vital for survival. Neglect could have serious consequences. Scholars still debate whether these chores were strictly divided by skill, age, or gender, but in practice, cooperation and efficiency dominate over rigid hierarchy. You move toward the fire pit, the small flames casting a golden glow on frost-patterned walls. Fringe tidbit: some Norse communities placed reflective metal or polished bone behind fires to amplify heat, a simple but effective trick for warming larger areas. You watch the flicker illuminate sleeping mats and tool racks, noting the subtle ingenuity embedded in every design choice. Humor creeps in as you imagine a modern interior designer struggling to sell the turf aesthetic for minimalist Arctic chic. Nearby, a neighbor demonstrates a method of freezing fish using ice blocks while simultaneously storing firewood inside snow-covered pits. Mainstream historical fact: layering and insulating perishable goods in ice or snow allowed extended storage, essential during months without daylight and during harsh winter storms. Scholars still argue whether these methods varied regionally or were standardized across northern settlements, but the effectiveness is clear as you examine neatly stacked blocks ready for long-term preservation. The community gathers near the hearth to share knowledge and updates. You listen to discussions about the day's hunting, ice conditions, and techniques for crafting or repairing tools. Fringe observation: oral knowledge often included small rituals or charms, a blend of superstition and practical advice designed to reinforce focus and skill. Humor surfaces when one neighbor dramatically pantomimes a failed ice crossing, eliciting laughter while subtly teaching risk awareness. You notice the patterns of daily life weaving together seamlessly. Fishing, hunting, clothing maintenance, tool repair, and storytelling each feed into the other. Mainstream historical fact: Arctic survival depended on understanding the synergy between environment, material culture, and social cohesion, with each community member contributing in essential ways. Scholars still debate the relative importance of individual skill versus communal knowledge, but here, balance and integration are undeniable. Later, you help repair a sled, examining worn runners and reinforcing them with bundled moss and leather ties. Fringe tidbit: some sagas describe sled repairs as ritualized, invoking luck and protection, merging superstition with practical survival skills. Humor creeps in as you note that even in the harshest conditions, humor and ritual serve as mental insulation, sustaining morale as effectively as layers of fur. Outside, the wind rattles against the turf walls and snowdrifts pile against the shelter's edges. You realize that vigilance is constant. Every gust, temperature drop, or structural weakness could impact safety. Mainstream historical fact: vigilance and daily maintenance were critical to Arctic survival, reducing risk from storms, ice instability, and extreme cold. Scholars still debate how much of this maintenance was communal versus individually assigned, but you see both approaches functioning in harmony here.
You participate in a brief storytelling circle, adding your observations of ice formations, animal tracks, and the subtle tricks of the sun. Fringe observation. Stories often included practical lessons disguised as adventure or humor, reinforcing survival skills in memorable, engaging ways. Humor persists when one neighbor embellishes a tale about a fox stealing provisions, turning a mundane event into a theatrical cautionary tale. As night, or the Arctic equivalent, settles, you help arrange furs and bedding to maximize warmth. Mainstream historical fact: sleep in Arctic settlements was carefully structured to conserve heat, maintain vigilance, and allow communal support. Scholars still argue about whether extended daylight disrupted natural rhythms or forced early adaptation, but the practical outcomes speak for themselves. Rested, prepared, and connected individuals increased survival odds. Finally, you take a moment to breathe deeply, appreciating the rhythm of life inside the turf walls. Shared work, humor, superstition, and resourceful adaptation. Fringe tidbit. Some Norse sagas suggest that the sounds of Arctic wildlife were interpreted as signals, subtly guiding community decision-making even at night. You close your eyes for a brief pause, aware that survival here is not just physical. It's woven from ingenuity, observation, connection, and the quiet, enduring presence of humor amidst hardship.
You awake to the faint glow of the Arctic sun, filtering through small turf windows, casting delicate frost patterns across the floor. Today is devoted to communal preparation for the deep winter, food preservation, tool maintenance, and the subtle choreography of group survival. Mainstream historical fact: Vikings in Arctic regions relied heavily on cooperative labor to ensure adequate food storage, shelter maintenance, and clothing readiness, as individual effort alone was rarely sufficient. Scholars still argue whether structured schedules or flexible, situational cooperation predominated, but the results speak for themselves in the thriving community around you. You join neighbors stacking frozen fish into insulated pits, carefully layering them with snow and moss. Fringe tidbit. Some sources suggest that certain Viking groups would whisper encouragements to the stored fish, a quirky ritual that supposedly kept the cold spirits at bay. You laugh softly, enjoying the absurdity while marveling at the practicality behind the method. Each layer of insulation, however ritualized, adds real thermal protection. Next, you move to sharpen and inspect hunting and fishing tools. Mainstream historical fact: maintaining blades, hooks, and other implements was essential, as a dull knife or damaged net could mean lost food or increased danger during travel. Fringe observation: Viking craftsmen sometimes engraved small protective symbols on tools, blending superstition with functionality in a way that reinforced confidence and focus. You watch a neighbor trace a tiny rune on a blade, imagining the centuries-old interplay of belief and practicality at work. Outside, the sun casts long, pale shadows across snow-drifted rooftops. You trudge toward a distant ice patch to check a stored net. The icy landscape eerily quiet, except for the crunch of your boots. Humor creeps in as you imagine a Viking poet composing an epic about the heroic struggle against particularly obstinate ice. Mainstream historical fact: checking and maintaining fishing nets was critical, preventing spoilage and ensuring successful catches during the darkest months. Scholars still debate the frequency and techniques, but each inspection reinforces the practical rhythm of survival. Back inside, the community gathers to sort collected food and inspect winter supplies. You notice subtle social cues. Younger members assist elders, while experienced hunters offer advice on storage techniques. Fringe tidbit: some sagas note playful tests, where younger members guessed weight or quantity of stored goods, a combination of training, entertainment, and communal bonding. You participate, laughing quietly at a misjudged fish bundle, appreciating how humor softens labor and strengthens cohesion. The fire pit emits gentle warmth as you and neighbors carefully dry furs, layer them for storage, and repair small tears. Mainstream historical fact: fur preparation was essential not only for warmth, but also for clothing and trade, demanding precision and knowledge of natural materials. Scholars still argue whether drying and storage techniques were standardized or improvised based on local climate conditions, but the process itself is meticulous and almost meditative. You step outside briefly to observe the Arctic sky, the sun hanging low in a consistent glow. Fringe observation, Vikings sometimes used subtle color changes in the sky or ice reflections to predict weather, combining observation with accumulated knowledge and instinct. Humor flits through your mind as you imagine someone arguing with the sky over its accuracy, a timeless human tendency even in extreme conditions. Returning to the shelter, you participate in a communal meal, simple, sustaining, and layered with quiet conversation. Mainstream historical fact, shared meals reinforced bonds, distributed resources efficiently, and provided an opportunity for storytelling and knowledge transfer. Scholars still debate whether ritualized aspects of meals were more about community cohesion or superstition, but here both are palpable. As the day winds down, you join a brief storytelling circle, recounting experiences on the ice, minor mishaps, and observations of wildlife. Fringe tidbit, humor, exaggeration, and playful misdirection are woven into tales, subtly teaching lessons while entertaining. Laughter mixes with the smell of smoke, dried fish, and furs, a comforting symphony against the Arctic chill outside. Finally, as the day closes, you prepare your sleeping area, layering furs and blankets to maximize warmth. Mainstream historical fact, careful preparation of sleeping spaces was critical for survival in sub-zero temperatures, with attention to ventilation, insulation, and proximity to others. Scholars still debate whether these sleeping arrangements followed strict rules or emerged organically through experience, but the combination of ingenuity, observation, and human connection ensures comfort and safety. You lie down, the shelter hums gently around you, and the persistent Arctic light outside gradually softens your thoughts, preparing you for rest.
The shelter is quiet now, the low murmur of neighbors' breathing blending with the soft hiss of Arctic wind against turf walls. You lie on a thick bed of furs, the warmth seeping slowly into your chilled limbs. Outside, the light from the Arctic sun stretches endlessly, diffused and gentle, painting the snow in muted shades of white, blue, and pale gold. Your body relaxes, each muscle releasing tension accumulated over days of trudging, hauling, and careful observation. You let your mind drift over the rhythm of survival, the delicate choreography of clothing layers, the subtle art of ice fishing, the cautious steps across frozen fjords, and the shared laughter and storytelling that wove the community together. Every detail, the crunch of snow under boots, the glint of ice, the faint scent of fish drying over heated stones, folds into memory, becoming a quiet testament to resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation. Fringe tidbit. Some Norse texts suggest that these sensory memories were deliberately cultivated to strengthen intuition for future survival, a form of mental rehearsal embedded in daily life. Your thoughts soften around small moments of humor, a fox darting across a snowy plain, a neighbor's exaggerated tumble on ice, the whispered encouragements to stored fish. These moments are more than amusement. They are reminders of human creativity and levity in the harshest conditions. Mainstream historical fact. Humor and ritual in Arctic communities played a subtle but crucial role in maintaining mental resilience and social cohesion, counteracting isolation, fatigue, and cold. Scholars still debate how intentional these practices were, but their effects are unmistakable. You notice the calm persistence of the Arctic environment, wind sculpting snow, shadow stretching slowly, and distant wildlife moving with quiet purpose. The day's efforts, hunting, fishing, maintaining clothing, and tending the shelter, blend seamlessly into the rhythm of the land, a reminder that survival is not just physical, but also mental and emotional. Fringe observation. Vikings often reported that observing nature closely and patiently strengthened intuition, anticipation, and patience, qualities as essential as warmth or sustenance. Slowly, your breathing evens, syncing with the subtle cadence of the shelter, the faint creak of timber, the gentle hiss of heated stones cooling, the soft whisper of fur shifting under neighbors settling in for rest. You feel a profound calm,
the Arctic light painting a gentle glow that presses against closed eyelids, guiding you toward sleep. Mainstream historical fact. Careful attention to environment, communal support, and personal preparation allowed Arctic dwellers not only to survive, but to find comfort, even amid extreme conditions. Let your thoughts drift over distant fjords, frozen plains, and endless ice. Imagine the meticulous care, humor, and ingenuity required to thrive here, skills honed over generations. The persistent light outside softens further, fading gently, wrapping the world in muted tones. You are warm, prepared, and connected, a small part of an enduring story that stretches back centuries. Fringe tidbit. Some Norse storytellers claim that sleep itself, when approached with mindfulness and preparation, was a tool for strengthening memory and skill, a nightly rehearsal for survival. Your eyelids grow heavy. The Arctic wind whispers against turf walls, the faint scent of smoke and dried fish fades into memory, and the hum of shared life in the shelter lulls you deeper. Humor, resilience, and quiet observation merge into a steady pulse of calm, carrying you toward rest. Every sensation softens, the crunch of snow, the glint of ice, the warmth of layered furs, all fading gently into the comforting embrace of sleep. You exhale slowly, allowing the Arctic's subtle rhythm to envelop you. The community sleeps, the ice rests, and you drift, secure in the knowledge that ingenuity, observation, and human connection have carried you this far. The light outside is soft, the shelter warm, and your mind at ease. End of story. Sweet dreams.